My name is Bival Acharya. I'm a faculty member at UCSF, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And in this brief lecture, we'll be going over just the very basics of motivational interviewing. So these are the learning objectives for the presentation today. And before we even start, I want to be very clear that you really cannot learn MI in a couple of hours, right? So this is just a basic introduction for some basic concepts. A full training of MI is easily sort of 30 hours plus. So I'm hoping what you learn today will provide the platform for you to continue to build your MI skills. So for this presentation, I'm hoping you'll be able to learn three basic components of MI. You can review some patient encounter transcripts and be able to say these elements or statements are consistent with MI and these other elements are not consistent with MI. And also look at some examples of patient encounters and be able to generate some MI consistent responses. So let's start by defining what motivational interviewing means. So the first definition is a short one. So, and I've highlighted sort of the unique keywords that are specific to MI. It's a collaborative conversational style for strengthening a person's own motivation and commitment to change. First, it's collaborative. So when you're talking to a patient, it's not one-sided. And your goal is really to strengthen the patient or the person you're speaking with, their motivation, their own motivation to change. Here's a longer definition, and we'll come back to both of these after at the end of the lecture, so that if these terms are not clear, hopefully they become clearer after we go through this. So it's a collaborative, goal-oriented style of communication with particular attention to the language of change. So this specific phrase about language of change, this is actually what makes MI more sort of stands out, or more, it makes it more unique compared to other counseling styles. And it is designed to strengthen personal motivation for and commitment to a specific goal by eliciting and exploring the person's own reasons for change. Again, it goes back to its very person centered, patient centered style within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. And we will define what these terms mean. Again, they sound sort of these nice, warm, and fuzzy terms, but what does it really mean and how you operationalize it is going to be a big part of what we'll be talking about today. There are many ways to sort of take apart the overall concept of MI. And I like this Venn diagram that sort of says you have the MI spirit, and then OARS, which is a set of skills, and then change talk, like I said, that is a more unique part of MI. And to deliver motivational interviewing, you sort of need to be aware of all these components. And we'll go through each one of them one at a time. So the first component of MI, the part of MI, is the MI spirit. So this is sort of how you think of MI. It's not actually a behavior. It's not operationalizing anything. It's sort of how you think of it. These are the principles that guide MI. And a good way to think about this is when you're working with someone, it really should be more like a dance rather than like a fight or wrestling. And when you are talking to someone and it feels like you're wrestling with them, that's when you know that you probably lost the MI spirit, and you gotta re-engage and reset and try to do something more synchronous and harmonious and sort of something that's more collaborative, like a dance. But we will go through sort of the four components, subcomponents rather, of MI spirit now. So the first component is partnership. And what this means is both patient and the provider have specific expertise that they bring to the partnership. Now, this may sound really nice and sort of obvious even to some people, but oftentimes when we interact with patients, they come to us in our clinic, for example, and we really sort of convey that we're the experts and we're the ones who sort of tell them what to do and we're the ones who have knowledge. Whereas in true MI spirit, you actually always want to remember that this is indeed a partnership, and the way to operationalize that is by remembering that the patient also has specific expertise. So what we'll do now is we'll look at patient encounter statements, and then we will sort of assess whether what's being said is consistent with MI or not. So let's look at this one, right? So the patient is saying, "I've already heard all the things I'm supposed to do to lose weight. nothing works for me. And the provider responds by saying, I recently learned about the benefits of intermittent fasting. Would you like to spend some time discussing this? So at this point, you can pause the video and then think about whether the provider's response is consistent with MI or not. And for either reaction you may have, try to see if you can use some of the MI principles, the actual language that we've been talking about, to say why or why not this is consistent with MI. So let's do that for a second. Now remember, partnership, right? So both the patient and provider have specific expertise that they bring to the partnership. And the statement that we just looked at really does not convey that. It really conveys, I have the expertise, I have knowledge about this thing called intermittent fasting, and I'm going to tell you that. So, because of the failure of that statement to convey partnership, I would say that that statement from the provider was actually not consistent with MI. And if that's true, then how should we respond? So again, pause and come up with a response for this statement from the patient that is more consistent with the MI spirit. Again, pause the video and try to come up with a statement in response. And I'll give an example, not because this is the only way to respond, but at least as an example of how you could respond, especially when you're thinking about the principle of partnership in responding to this patient. So you could say, I'm sorry to hear that. Can you tell me more about why those things didn't work for you? So when we say the patient has specific expertise as well, and not just you as a provider, this is what the patient's expertise could be, right? So they are the experts in their life, in their experiences, and they can tell you what they've done and what has and has not worked for them. So you always want to actually elicit that before jumping into, well, here's an idea. Because again, as providers, we're trained to do that. And one of the important skills in MI is learning how to not sort of give in to that impulse of trying to tell people what to do, and being able to start by saying, well, actually, let me see the world from your perspective. Let me hear how it's like to be you, and that's actually the starting point, and that leads to a true partnership. So relatedly, again, you can pause the video here. So do you think, as an MI practitioner, are you leading the patient or are you following the patient? And it's sort of a trick question, because the answer really is, if it's a true partnership, there are times when you will be leading and there are times when you'll be following. And this makes MI again different from other types of counseling styles where maybe it's explicit that you are expected to lead the patient, and a more sort of a analytical approach where you're just have no agenda really and you're just following the patient. So MI is neither of those. And again, those different styles of always leading the patient or always following the patient have serve a different purpose. But if our goal is to engage in partnership with the patient to sort of try to elicit behavior change, then there'll be times when we will be leading and there'll be times when we will be following. Now we're looking at the second subcomponent of MI spirit, and that is acceptance. Acceptance can actually be further broken down. Again, my goal is to try to make this as operationalizable as possible rather than just terms that sort of sound nice but rather vague. So acceptance has four subcomponents, and they all start with A to make it easier to remember. So the first one is absolute worth. What this means is, clients will sometimes, actually quite often, make choices that we may disagree with. And we may look at them and say, well, I would never do that. I would never make the kind of choices that you're making, right? And that can often lead us to sort of judge a patient in a negative light. And again, it happens very often in society. But we got to remember that just because they make choices that are different from the kind of choices that we would make, they still have absolute worth as a human being and deserve respect and acceptance, because that's it, just because they're a human being. So that's the first part of acceptance. The second part of acceptance is autonomy. And autonomy is actually quite tricky because it can imply that the person has the ability to do whatever they want, but that's actually not true, of course. Like, we're part of a social, fabric. There are structures in place that take away our autonomy. Autonomy in this instance means more regarding I think that the dog has some opinions about this. Uh, regarding the autonomy from the provider. So you as a provider cannot make someone thirsty is a good thing that I remember sometimes, right? So you cannot make them want to do X, Y, and Z. They have the autonomy. At the end of the day, they're the ones who will decide whether they want to take meds or not. And to think that because you're the doctor and you told them to take meds, they must, right? So that is inconsistent with the idea of autonomy and thus the idea of acceptance. Accurate empathy. This is, of course, a big component of any kind of healing relationship, but particularly in an MI, your goal is to see the world as the patient does. And again, you don't have to agree. This is a really important distinction between understanding and agreement. You don't need to agree with the way the person sees the world, but you must start by understanding how they see the world. And that requires accurately being able to see the world through the patient's eyes. The fourth A under acceptance is affirmation. And we'll get into this a little bit more because affirmation is actually also a tool that we'll talk about in the next part. So maintaining hope and identifying strengths rather than dwelling largely on things that the person is doing incorrectly or you disagree with them. You sort of flip that and really focus on, well, what are the things that they are doing right and what are the strengths that the person has. And again, all of these, if you do them, you convey acceptance. You operationalize acceptance rather than just believing, oh, I accept the patient as they are. When you engage in these four things, you're able to actually convey to the patient that you're accepting them. All right, let's go back to looking at some of the patient encounter scripts. So the patient says, I know you and my wife and everyone around me will get upset, but I hate taking these medications. Again, some patients may not be this, forthcoming, but this patient says this. Now the provider responds by saying, if you do not want to worry your wife, maybe an easier way out is to just take these medications. Let's pause the video and think about whether this is consistent with MI or not. And as always, think about whatever your answer is, think about which principles are either being violated if you think it's inconsistent, or which principles are being engaged in if you do think it's consistent with MI. Let's pause the video and think about that script. So what I think is concerning about the earlier response is that it is against the ideas, for example, of autonomy, right? So the provider is well-meaning, don't get me wrong. They're trying to sort of find a tricky way to get the person to change their behavior. But ultimately what they're saying is you really should just do something so that they'll, get your wife off your back, right? And it does not convey autonomy. And because of that, it does not convey acceptance. So another way to respond would be what, right? So again, pause the video and think about how you could respond in a way that conveys acceptance, looking at the 4 A's that we talked about earlier. So again, this is not the only way to respond, but one example of many. So you could say, you do not like taking these medications. No one can make you take these medications. Again, if you look at the language here, I'm not saying, or the provider rather, is not saying anything about whether it's a good thing to take these medications or a bad thing to take these medications, right? So they're just reflecting back and they're saying, I'm hearing that you do not like taking these medications. And I'm hearing that no one can make you take these medications as well, right? So what the provider has done is that they've conveyed autonomy, that I get it, no one's going to make you do this. It's you're in charge here. And that kind of stance often helps the person actually just put their guards down, become less defensive, and engage with you in a more sort of honest and meaningful conversation versus the often kind of provider badgering them and the patient feeling kind of defensive. All right, so the third subcomponent of MI spirit is compassion. And we'll talk about what that means and then how it's related to this guy smoking a cigarette. Compassion, again, I actually don't like that term, just to be completely honest. It's used in the MI literature, so I'm using it just so that you're familiar with how it's used. But the way compassion is used in local vernacular English is different from how MI is trying to use, so which makes it a little bit difficult to convey. But all that aside, what we mean by compassion when we're talking about in this context is it's beyond just caring about the person, but it's actually making a commitment to the patient's welfare. which is different from the sort of sympathetic attitude or almost this condescending attitude. Oh, you poor suffering soul. It's not that. Like, that's not what we mean by compassion here. It really means, well, I'm making a commitment to your welfare. Like whatever's important for you, that's what I'm actually going to prioritize. You're acting in the patient's best interest and not yours. And again, you got to be careful, of course, that oftentimes, especially in the kind of setting that you're working in, there are structures in place that don't let you do this. Like you want to work in a patient's best interest, but the structures sort of prioritize other things that are not in the patient's best interest. So you got to be aware of that. So again, don't want to be naive that you can always do this. And it's the opposite of a salesperson. Like a salesperson may use all the tactics or skills that we talked about, but at the end of the day, their goal isn't actually to do something that's in the patient's best interest. A salesperson's main goal is to, sell them something so that they make money, right? And you got to remember that oftentimes, again, these structures turn us into salespeople. But our goal should always be, I'm going to do what's in the best interest for the patient rather than your best interest. All right, back to some patient encounters. So the patient says, I don't know what to do here. I feel stuck. I don't want to live this way anymore. What should I do? And the provider responds, I'm offering a workshop this weekend. It is expensive, but I think you really need it. Again, you can pause the video and talk about if this is consistent with MI or not, and talk about which principles are at play here. So in a way, this is sort of an obvious one, right? So there's obviously issues of conflicts of interest as well, but really the provider seems to be thinking about their best interest rather than what's in the best interest of the patient. So how could you respond in a way that conveys compassion? So here's an example. You could say, sounds like things are really tough, right? So you're reflecting and you're not making a recommendation either way. And you can say, I have some ideas about what might help, but first, let me hear what you've already considered. Again, you go back to what the person's already thought about. Go back to what the person's already considered. And this is interesting because clearly the patient's saying, what should I do? And oftentimes we think of that as a prompt to be like, all right, here's what you should do, right? But in true MI, you actually do not want to give advice as much as possible unless you feel like you've exhausted, you've actually completely understood the world from the person's perspective regarding this behavior, of course, not everything in the world. And then you actually want to say, let me see what you've already tried. Let me see what you've already considered so that you don't first, just for efficiency's sake, you don't waste your time, you don't waste their time either, and also to make sure that you convey that you're really interested in how they see the world and how their experiences have been, and then only you can say, all right, I have some ideas. Would you like to hear them? And when they sort of say yes, then you start maybe giving advice. Um, Related to that is evocation, right? So what this means is you want to draw out ideas and solutions from the patient. And this is related to the earlier quote where the person was like, what should I do here? And as much as possible, if the ideas and solutions come from the patient, the people have actually studied this, that behavior change is more likely to happen if the patient comes up with the ideas and solutions rather than the provider. And that's what evocation really means. You want to evoke ideas from the person. And that requires a lot of listening, it requires a lot of asking questions about what has worked, what has not worked, what do you think it works. So just asking them a lot rather than just telling them. Again, I'm not saying you should never, give them any advice. That's obviously not what they're saying. If they're clearly asking for advice, give them advice, right? But still, your goal should still be trying to evoke it from the patient rather than sort of tell them. All right. So I'm just going to summarize the subcomponents of MI Spirit before we go to the next part of the presentation. Partnership, both have expertise. Acceptance, which has 4 A's: absolute worth, autonomy, accurate empathy, and affirmation. Compassion, which really means looking out for the patient's best interest. And then evocation, so drawing out ideas and solutions from the patient. You can remember this via PACE. That is the acronym that I use to remember the components of MI Spirit. And what we will do next is move on to sort of operationalizing some of this. Again, MI Spirit is like how you think about this, but we have already touched on some of the operationalizing strategies as well. So back to the Venn diagram, we completed the first circle, MI Spirit. Now we're going to talk about OARS. What are OARS? Literally, they are tools that we use in MI. These are strategies. These sort of define more about what you actually do in the session. And will OARS are sort of, they come from, they're based on the MI spirit. And you may have heard of them in sort of other types of counseling as well, not just specific to MI. We'll go through them, and then we go to the final component, which is going to be about change talk. All right. The patient says, there's no hiding it. I'm worried about my weight. I don't want to get sick. And the provider says, oh, I see. You don't want to get a dangerous illness like diabetes, right? Now, again, there's nothing inherently wrong with this, but pause and see if you can pinpoint which component of MI this seems to be sort of inconsistent with. All right, so we've been talking about open-ended questions, so obviously it is not an open-ended question, right? So open-ended questions is the first component of OARS, right? So the script that we saw earlier was a closed-ended one. So it sort of said, "Hey, you're worried about diabetes, right?" Like you sort of made an assumption and you wanted to test it with a yes or no question, which is an open-ended question, versus I'm sorry, a closed-ended question, versus maybe we can come up with an open-ended question for this. And you can think about a potential response here. And as an example, tell me what worries you about your weight. Right? So they've told you they're worried about it, but actually you don't know why they're worried. You made an assumption that they're worried about diabetes. I once had a patient who told me her main worry was actually it was difficult to find clothes that fit, right? And that actually was the engine, the driver of change for her. But in my mind, I was like, oh, you must be worried about diabetes or whatever. Again, and if you say that, what you're really conveying to the patient is I'm not really seeing the world from the patient's perspective. I'm seeing the world from my perspective. So a good way to avoid that is by asking questions like, hey, tell me what worries you about your weight, if the patient's telling you that they're worried about your weight. All right. Now the patient says, it's a different patient. I will tell you what I told all the other doctors that came before you. You are not going to change my mind. And the provider says, it'll be difficult to work with you or work together if you are set on your decision. I'm ready to work with you, but only if you are. So I'd heard, statements like these in the past. So I thought, we could unpack this a little bit. So again, pause, think about why it is or is not consistent with MI. So in my mind, this is not consistent because it sort of violates the MI spirit, right? So when I look at that interaction, it really just feels like fighting with the patient rather than dancing with the patient. And this brings us to the A part of OARS, which is affirmations. Again, we touched on affirmations in the earlier part about MI spirit. But what are affirmations? Affirmations recognize strengths, efforts, values, and reinforce successes and intentions. It's actually really important to remember these components because this is a good way to operationalize affirmations. Which, if you're not careful, it sounds kind of very fake and superficial. Like, oh yeah, you're doing a good job, that kind of affirmation, which patients will know is just sort of superficial. But if you can specifically recognize the strengths of the patient, what efforts they're making, what are the kind of values that they're conveying, and any successes they have, reinforce that, or even if they have intentions to succeed, reinforce those as well. So these are clear, strategies on how do you demonstrate affirmation. So with this in mind, how would you respond to, again, it's the same script of the person. Again, pause the video and think about how you could respond using affirmations. Again, one example, right? So it sounds like when you make a decision, you really stick with it. Again, I'm not making any value judgment about, the person's stubborn or whatever. And again, once you have these adjectives in your mind, oh, the person's stubborn, think about, well, what would be a flip side of someone who's stubborn? Like, it's not always a bad thing to be stubborn, right? If this person makes a decision to take medications, they probably will be amazing at taking medications because you're so good at just following through and being, unquote unquote stubborn. So you could reflect on that and say, it sounds like when you make a decision, you really stick with it. All right. Another patient encounter. So this quote actually in particular will work with this many times because it's quite rich and has a lot of interesting components. So the patient says, I try really hard not to smoke around my son, but I've been smoking for 10 years, except during pregnancy. It's so stressful being a single mom with a full time job, so I started to smoke again. And the provider says, you were able to stop when you were pregnant. If you could do it then, I know you can do it again. You clearly have it in you to stop. All right, let's pause the video. Am I consistent or am I inconsistent? So this brings us to R. Again, remember we're at OARS, right? So OAR, we're at R. Reflections. Probably one of the hardest things to do in MI compared to sort of other types of therapy. So reflections are not questions or statements. So that's one clue for you that if you're asking a lot of questions in response, you're not actually reflecting. And let's start with the simplest type of reflection, which is repeating or restating what the person said. So instead of sort of saying, "Hey, yeah, you could do it because you did it in the past," which again sounds like affirmation, and that's why I wanted to put that kind of quote. But let's see if we can reflect. Again, we can start with a simple reflection, which simply repeats or restates something. It's a very essential part of conveying to the patient that you're hearing them and you're not judging them. Again, remember acceptance and compassion. Those are the two basic components of MI spirit that we have to always have in the back of our mind. So, with that in mind, how would you respond by making a simple reflection in response to what the person said? Pause and think about that. All right, here's one example. I hear you saying that it's very stressful for you being a single mom. That's it. Again, I didn't make any judgments about, oh, you started smoking again. I didn't say any of that. Oh, yeah, you can do it. None of that. I just said, I hear you that it's very stressful being a single mom. And the more details you can add, the more you convey that you heard them, as opposed to saying, I hear you, right? Which is fine, again, depending on the flow of the conversation, that might be appropriate. But if you can restate or sort of repeat, even if your restating is harder. So restating would be changing the words a little bit, repeating would be literally saying what they said to you. And that's also a very good reflective technique. But this is a simple reflection. We'll get to the more complex ones in a second, but this is a simple reflection. All right, so OARS, this is the second component. These are what you would say and do in the session. So open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summarizations. So I'm not going to get into summarizations because what it really means is after you have a sort of a brief encounter, maybe like a couple of minutes, and the patient says a lot of things, you sort of just summarize it back to them. You say, all right, so what I'm hearing is, and then you sort of have a paragraph, which is just harder to do in this PowerPoint format. But summarizations, again, are actually a longer form of reflections. They convey that you've been listening. They convey that you are able to, incorporate all the things that they said and sort of present it back to them. And there are ways to summarize that encourage change talk versus others, but really talking about reflection, I think, helps move this along. So again, OARs are specific tools that you'd use in the middle of a patient encounter. All right, back to our Venn diagrams. We've covered MI spirit, we've covered OARS, and now we'll be talking about change talk. Change talk is, I mentioned this earlier, is unique to MI, and and this has been studied quite a lot. And just as an aside, people actually do not know why MI works, right? So from like a more like an empirical sense. We know it works. It is the most evidence-based sort of behavior change counseling style compared to all others. It's the most effective, but we actually don't know why it works so well. And one of the things that has come up quite a lot in literature is the more time patients spend in change talk, the more it predicts actual behavior change. So change talk becomes really important. So what does it mean? What does change talk mean? So we'll talk about that, and then we'll also talk about to what you can do to encourage change talk. So let's talk about what change talk really means. I'll define it. It may sound weird, but once I actually look at the scripts, once we look at the scripts together, it'll be easier to understand what that means. So these are patient statements favoring direction of change. I know it may seem really vague. So what we mean by change, for example, someone's smoking, they're engaging in unhealthy behaviors. Our goal is to help them change. right? So when it says direction of change, we mean in the direction of healthy behaviors. So patient statements, the things that patient says, not you as a provider, the patient's going to be saying these things. So the patient's statements that favor direction of change, meaning it indicates something that pushes or is likely to push the patient in the direction of healthy behaviors. All right, let's look at a patient script to make it easier. So this is the same um, statement from the patient. We had looked at it earlier as well. So pause the video and try to identify change talk. And again, the definition is patient statements favoring direction of change. Right. So when she says, I try hard not to smoke around my son, that's indicating that she probably is interested in changing, or it might predict change in the future. And except during pregnancy. So she actually did not smoke during her pregnancy. So that again is favoring direction of change. The other part of change talk is that it's more effective if it's in the present tense. So for the person to say, I stopped when I was pregnant is change talk, but it's actually about something that happened in the past. So ideally, you want to evoke change talk that is present focused. And OARS can be used, particularly reflections and summarizations actually, to engage the patient in change talk. And what I do when I'm doing MI with a patient is sort of just like at a meta level. I try to keep track of how much the patient is engaging in change talk during the interaction. And if I notice that the patient is not engaging in change talk during the interaction with me, that's an indicator for me that I got to do something with my MI spirit or OARS or something to set the course right. Because if I'm not hearing change talk, it's things are not going as well as I would like to. The other side of change talk is sustained talk. Again, these are written in like a language that sounds vague because it doesn't have any sort of value judgment. It's not saying good talk or bad talk or positive talk or negative talk. And it's of course by intention because we don't want to bring that kind of judgment in these interactions. But the opposite of change talk is sustained talk. And again, it's the same quote from earlier. And sustained talk are also patient statements that oppose change and they maintain the current status. So if you got someone with a behavior that you think is unhealthy and they're making statements that are in the direction of maintaining that behavior, I mean sustaining that behavior, that is sustained talk. So pause the video and identify elements of this script that would qualify as sustained talk. All right, so I've been smoking for 10 years. Yeah, that means it's gonna be hard to change that behavior. And then in the current phase, the person saying stressful being a single mom with the full-time job, so I started smoking again. And this is actually very common to hear elements of change talk and sustain talk within the same statement. It's actually very common, and it's actually a sign that you're doing something right. Now, if the patient's only saying sustain talk all the time, it probably means that the patient's feeling really defensive about what you're saying. If the patient's only giving you change talk all the time, uh, if they're being completely honest, that's wonderful because it predicts actual behavior change. But oftentimes, when the patient's saying, yes, yes, I'll take all the medications, yes, I'll come to the follow up, yes, I'll stop smoking, oftentimes they're just telling you what they think you want to hear and they just want the interview to be done and so they can go home. So seeing a mix of both change talk and sustain talk in the same statement is in a way reassuring that the patient feels comfortable and they're able to share this sort of complicated relationship they have with their behavior, and they feel safe with you that they can share all this with you. uh, which is why I always remind people that ambivalence is a normal part of change. When someone's ambivalent, our reaction almost is to say, don't think about the negative stuff, just think about the positive stuff, as if we think ambivalence is an impediment, or it's you're going the wrong direction. But ambivalence is actually very normal. Sort of being at the crossroads is very normal. It's part of change. And And failing to acknowledge ambivalence actually decreases the likelihood of change, right? So pretending that there is no ambivalence, that the person is set on going on the path of change, fails to acknowledge ambivalence, and the patient's left thinking, well, not no, the doctor doesn't really know how difficult it is for me to change, and how I'm being pulled in both directions. So you actually want to be able to acknowledge ambivalence, because it does all the things that we've been talking about: MI spirit, affirmations, accurate empathy, being able to see the world from their perspective. All right, back to our favorite script. After hearing all of this, how would you respond, right? So we did a simple reflection earlier. So let me pull that up again. So I hear you saying that it's very stressful for you being a single mom. That was a simple reflection. The strategy is something a little bit more complicated that does acknowledge ambivalence. Like, how would you do that? So let's pause the video, and how would you respond in a way that actually acknowledges ambivalence? Because this statement, there's nothing wrong with it, but it actually doesn't do that, which is fine. But if you wanted to be deliberate about acknowledging ambivalence, what could you say? How would you respond? All right, so this is one example, right? So you say, on the one hand, you try not to smoke around your son, and on the other hand, you're so stressed that you end up smoking. So this reflects back both the change talk from the patient and the sustained talk from the patient. And this format of, on the one hand, something something, on the other hand, something something, that actually is always a good way for you to convey sort of acknowledgement of ambivalence. And this kind of response is called a double-sided reflection. And we'll go a little bit deeper into it, because this kind of double-sided reflection has been shown to be really effective at changing behaviors. So what you want to do is going to be a little bit different from what I wrote earlier, because again, we're trying to sharpen the response here. So a double-sided reflection, which emphasizes change talk, has been predicted to increase the likelihood of the patient engaging in change talk and ultimately the behavior changing. So what does this mean? So you want to end your double-sided reflection in change talk. And again, this will become clearer when you look at a script again. You can do it, that's one strategy, so by ending reflection in change talk. Another strategy by overshooting sustained talk. Another strategy is by undershooting change talk. Okay, let's just look at scripts. It'll become clearer. Again, back to the same script, right? So how would you respond to this using this particular strategy of using a double-sided reflection that emphasizes change talk by ending the reflection in change talk? Meaning, you could say, on one hand, blah, blah, on the other hand, blah, blah. So when you end your statement, ideally, you want to be reflecting back the change talk component and not the sustained talk component. So here's an example. On the one hand, you're so stressed that you end up smoking, but on the other hand, you try not to smoke around your son. So what this did compared to the previous response was it flipped it, right? So previously we had said, on the one hand, you try not to smoke around your son, but on the other, you end up smoking because life is so stressful. So what happens is, and people have tracked these sort of transcripts, what happens is whatever you end your double-sided reflection on is what the patient ends up picking up and building on, right? So if you end with you're so stressed out that you end up smoking, they're like, yeah, life is so stressful, I'm smoking so much. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're at a stage where you are trying to evoke, sort of learn the world from their perspective, do all of that, that's fine. But if you're saying, you know what, this is time for me to do some double-sided reflection because I feel like I've built rapport, we really want to go on the stage of engaging the person to do more change talk, then you want to purposefully flip that so that you end your double-sided reflection with change talk being reflected back, which in this case is you're trying not to smoke around your son. This is something that's happening right now. Not, oh, you stopped 10 years ago when you were pregnant. That may be relevant, but not as relevant as right now she tries not to smoke around her son. That's something you can build on. All right, another strategy of eliciting change talk is by overshooting sustained talk. So this is essentially exaggerating their sustained talk so that you prompt the patient to sort of say, oh, no, 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 it's actually not that bad. So that you sort of get the person to engage in change talk that way. So how could you overshoot sustained talk. So look at the script, find the sustained talk, and come up with an exaggerated response that you can make that overshoots sustained talk. Pause the video and do that. All right, so here's an example. So you might say, and the stress is so bad that you never want to stop smoking. Stress being bad and that being the driver of smoking was the sustained talk. So what we did here is we exaggerated and we said, it's so bad that you never want to stop smoking. Most often likely, patients are going to listen to this and they might say, well, not never, I don't want to be smoking for the rest of my life. That is change talk. Right? So you got to be careful with these exaggerated responses because it may seem kind of dismissive, right? So you got to make sure that you use the right tone, you have the rapport with the patient, that they're not going to feel defensive because you're saying that. But the strategy is this. So you take the change talk and you amplify to a point that the patient's more likely to say, no, 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 I wouldn't do that. I do want to stop at some point, which is change talk. In the other direction, you can undershoot change talk. Same thing. Look at the script, pause the video, look at the script, identify change talk that you want to undershoot. You exaggerate in the other direction now. All right, so here's an example. And even trying to not smoke around your son feels impossible, right? So the change talk here was she tries her best not to smoke around her son, and you exaggerated that, and by saying, oh, even doing that, feels impossible. Again, not a question, it's a reflection, right? The more you end your statements in question mark, oftentimes patients feel sort of like they're being accused of something. It just sounds like a more confrontational dialogue if you listen to a script. The more you can end your statements, reflections, in periods rather than question marks, the more it feels like a free flowing, neutral, non accusatory dialogue. So, what we did here is we undershot. So, we said, oh, yeah, you're trying not to smoke around your son, but even that feels impossible. And she might say, well, I wouldn't say it's impossible, like all I really need to do is, every time I see my son, just throw away the cigarette, right? Again, now you're engaging in change talk. Now you're engaging the patient rather in change talk. So that's another strategy. These are harder, like I said, double-sided reflection is probably the easiest one, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of all three. All right, so we have completed all three components, right? So the MI spirit, OARS, and change talk. Toward the end of the presentation, we'll go back to sort of just summarization and finishing up. As promised, let's go back to look at the definition of MI, and I hope any terms that seemed vague and unclear at the beginning of the lecture, I hope they seem clearer and more operationalizable now. So it's a collaborative, right? So remember all the stuff we talked about partnership, they have expertise as well, and not just you. It's a conversational style for strengthening the person's own motivation. That's it. Like you're not trying to say, yeah, it's not coercive. It's not, you got to follow this, otherwise that. It's not threatening. You're trying to increase the person's own motivation and commitment to change. Digging deeper, it's collaborative, it's goal oriented, it's not open ended, it's not let's just talk about whatever you want. It's very goal oriented. Style of communication, and we pay particular attention to the language of change. We spend so much time talking about change talk, so that's where the sort of key ingredient of MI is. And it's designed to strengthen personal motivation for and commitment to a specific goal. Again, it's a goal oriented, quitting smoking, taking medications, delivering your kid at an institution rather than at home, like whatever the behavior that you're interested in, there's a specific goal that's explicit and clear at the beginning. By eliciting and exploring the person's own reasons for change. What do they care about? What are their values? What's important for them? I had a patient who, wouldn't stop smoking, and the providers were trying to tell her like how expensive it is to smoke, and she didn't care. She was like, "I'll sell my house if I need to. I will never give up smoking." And the providers came to me. It's like, "What do we do? Like, we got someone saying they're gonna give up their whole house, right?" But then I said, "Well, what is her reason for change?" And clearly, the providers didn't know that, right? And then as I was listening, I realized like it was a grandmother. She does not smoke around her grandkids, so that's her reason for change. And you will never learn that if you go in saying, here's why smoking is bad for you, this sort of educational approach, right? Because you would have to run through like 50 different, cons of smoking until you get to the one that she actually resonates with. And by that time, she's super defendant and she doesn't want to talk to you. So the goal really is, what are the person's own reasons for change? You got to figure that out. And all of this needs to happen within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. Acceptance, remember the 4 A's, including autonomy and affirmations, and absolute worth and accurate empathy. And then compassion, which is looking out for the person's best interest. All right, so we're toward the end of the presentation. I just added some tips for using MI to actually get buy-in from providers, because you might end up in situations where you have to teach people MI, or you have to teach people why MI is important, right? To motivate them to learn about motivational interviewing. The first point I make often is chronic diseases have little immediate feedback, right? So when you have diabetes, when you have hypertension, even when you smoke, drink alcohol that's unhealthy level, you don't actually get immediate feedback right when that behavior is happening or when that condition's there, like eating unhealthy food or not exercising. You don't get immediate negative feedback when you do those things, when you don't do healthy behaviors. Um, and when you compare that with something like an acute illness like pneumonia, right, or broken ankle, right, there's direct immediate feedback. You have a cough, you have a fever, you feel terrible, and you want to go and engage in healthy behaviors. When you talk about chronic diseases and a lot of these illnesses or conditions that have a behavioral component, there is no immediate feedback. So you actually the importance of MI goes up in situations like those, so that the internal motivation needs to be garnered using these techniques for chronic diseases. So MI is really important for chronic diseases in particular. Internal motivation is much more sustainable than external. You can use, sort of these cues and strategies like reward systems and all that, like external motivation, and which is fine sometimes, right? So you can jumpstart change using external motivation, but oftentimes it runs out. It's not as sustainable as someone who's internally motivated, because it's consistent with their values, and you're changing behaviors lets them do things that are ultimately important for them, and that kind of internal motivation enhancement is something that MI is really good at. I also try to remind both the providers and the patients that it is scary to leave a road for another. Remember the crossroads metaphor of ambivalence, right? It's actually easier to come back to the crossroads and then switch. I say this to parents as well and family members who sort of say, why can't he just stop drinking? And I said, it's actually really scary for them, because if they've been drinking for years and years, to just try to go from that road of drinking a lot to the other road of not drinking at all, I sort of, might say things like, well, we might have to go through the jungle to get from one road to another because there's no path. So a more sort of a helpful path is to actually walk back to the crossroads, which gets to the point of ambivalence, and then turn towards healthy behaviors. So talking about ambivalence and relapse and things like that as just normal parts of change. Rather than this fantasy that someone's going to immediately leave one road and take another. This is a way to reassure both the patients and the providers who might be getting frustrated, and often family members who are frustrated by lack of behavior change. And at the end of the day, less fighting and more dancing is more fun. A lot of times when we engage in these interactions with patients and they don't change behavior, we want them to change their behavior. It is really frustrating. It's exhausting. And when you use MI, life actually becomes easier, for everyone, because you are not butting heads with the patient all the time. All right, so this is one of the last slides. It will go through some of the metaphor a little bit more, right? So the horizon is the goal behavior. You're going in a particular direction. Again, it's not open-ended. It's actually pretty clear. Here's your goal in MI. OARS are sort of the fuel, that drive you in that direction. That's how you operationalize everything we talked about. Change talk indicates the direction. Sustained talk indicates the opposite direction. Right? So are you going towards the horizon or away from the horizon? Has to do with change talk. The more change talk the person engages in, the more they're going in the direction. MI spirit, again, maybe I'm pushing the metaphor a little too far here, but MI spirit is the actual boat. This is, that's the environment that holds you, that sustains you. And if that's leaky, if you don't convey acceptance and compassion, you'll never make it to the goal. Um, we didn't get to the 4 processes because I feel like that's something you can build up on your own, and that is the map that sort of tells you how to take this like 1 session, 2 session, 4 sessions, whatever, moving it forward. Now you can look this up, and the book, I'll be presenting that in the next slide, that has more details on this. So yeah, so there are many books on MI. Again, you can look at some of these more sort of theoretical books if you're interested. But I like this one because it's very practical. It has worksheets. It's designed for a practitioner, and a lot of the sort of principles and acronyms and all that I did pull from this book. So that's I recommend looking at this one if you want to continue to build your skills. But like any skill, it gets better by practice. So you have to do it. It's not enough to listen to this lecture. It's not enough to read a book. You need to do that just so you can learn the basics. But you got to put it to practice. You got to reflect. Did I use the MI spirit here? What I said, was that am I consistent? Could I have said it differently? That would be more am I consistent? When I use a double-sided reflection, did I end in sustained talk or change talk? And how do I do more to engage in change talk? So all these things you can do on your own. Ideally, you can have someone watch you and sort of sharpen your skills that way. But yeah, I hope the introduction was helpful, and I hope you continue to build your skills in MI to help patients move in the direction of healthy behaviors. Thank you.